Welcome to this tutorial video. This video introduces you to the domains General Economic and Social Development, Health, and Employment and Occupation of the Indigenous Navigators' Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence module. In this video, we introduce the concepts covered in this domain and the relevant human rights instruments. Domain General Economic and Social Development. This domain focuses on the following rights: the right to food and the right to housing, water, and sanitation. In the context of business activities, the recognition of these rights is critical for ensuring that states abide by their obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights of Indigenous peoples when developing and implementing measures and activities related to business activities, and ensuring that business actors are aware of their responsibility to respect these rights in their human rights and environmental due diligence processes. UNDRIP Article 21 outlines the right of Indigenous peoples to the improvement of their economic and social conditions, highlighting the need for effective and special measures to address the historic discrimination they have faced. These rights are enshrined in a range of binding human rights treaties, for example, in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or ICESCR. They are further interpreted by its treaty body, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or CESCA. Many of this committee's interpretations will be introduced in the description of the categories below. The enjoyment of these rights is important for the survival of Indigenous peoples and their flourishing as distinct peoples. This domain therefore considers whether and how these rights are met in ways that enable the physical and cultural survival of Indigenous peoples in the context of business activities. The right to food. The first category under this domain is the right to food. UNDRIP Article 21.1 clarifies that Indigenous peoples have the right without discrimination to the improvement of their economic and social conditions, including, inter alia, in the areas of education, employment, vocational training and retraining, housing, sanitation, health, and social security. While the right to food is not explicitly mentioned, the use of the term inter alia refers to all economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to food. The right to food is recognized in binding instruments, including Article 11.1 of ICESCR, which recognizes the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger. CESCR's General Comment number 12 on the right to adequate food has defined the right to food as being realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, have physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means of its procurement. Questions related to the right to food aim to document the experiences of Indigenous peoples regarding shortages of food within the last 5 years. This includes foods that make up the traditional diet of Indigenous communities. Housing, water, and sanitation is the second category under this domain. The right to water is referred to in Article 21 of UNDRIP and underpinned by binding human rights obligations, including Article 11 of ICESCR. CESCR's General Comment number 15 on the right to water has clarified that Indigenous peoples' access to water resources on their ancestral lands must be protected from encroachment and unlawful pollution, and that states should provide resources for Indigenous peoples to design, deliver, and control their access to water. SESCR General Comment number 15 further explains that the right to water is comprised of the following elements. Availability. The water supply for each person must be sufficient and continuous for personal and domestic uses. Accessibility. Water and water facilities and services have to be accessible to everyone without discrimination. And quality. The water required for each personal or domestic use must be safe and of an acceptable color, odor, and taste for each personal or domestic use. Questions under this category assess whether national legislation, policies, plans, or other measures regulate the protection of water sources and access to water for Indigenous communities when permits for business activities are issued, and aims to document the experiences of Indigenous peoples on the provision of drinking water by business activities. Domain Health. This domain addresses Indigenous peoples' right to health and how it may be affected by business activities. The right to health includes not only access to health services, but also the ability to maintain traditional medicines and health practices. Business activities in related legislation, policies, plans, or other measures can impact multiple aspects of Indigenous peoples' health. This includes both direct and indirect harms to physical and mental well-being, as well as disruptions to traditional healing systems. Business activities and related measures can be linked to or have caused water or soil pollution, leading to the degradation of areas with significance for traditional medicine and healing. Environmental and human rights impacts from business activities may contribute to mental health challenges such as stress, anxiety, and depression, particularly when communities face displacement or loss of cultural sites. Article 24 of UNDRIP affirms that Indigenous peoples have the right to their traditional medicines and to maintain their health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. Indigenous individuals also have the right to access, without any discrimination, to all social and health services. And Indigenous individuals have an equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. States shall take the necessary steps with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of this right. The right to health is also protected under binding international law, notably Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or ICESCR. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or CESCR, in its General Comment number 14, emphasizes that health services must be culturally respectful and responsive to the needs of communities. For Indigenous people specifically, this means that states must safeguard medicinal resources and ecosystems essential to traditional healing, ensure that health services are available, accessible, acceptable, and of good quality, including being culturally appropriate, and support Indigenous communities in designing and managing their own health services, and adopt measures that reflect their traditions, knowledge systems, and cultural practices. Under this domain, questions assess whether national law requires businesses to assess health risks to Indigenous communities, including impacts on traditional health practices, as part of the impact assessments and whether the state provides targeted health programs and tracks health indicators, including related to reproductive health, in areas affected by business activities. There are also questions that aim to record Indigenous peoples' experiences on whether their traditional healing practices may have been harmed, for example by pollution, and whether health impacts were indeed considered in assessments for new infrastructure or business projects. Domain: Employment and Occupation. This domain covers matters related to Indigenous peoples' right to work and equality in employment and occupations, and how this may be affected by business activities. Business activities and related legislation, policies, plans, or other measures can impact Indigenous peoples' ability to access their traditional territories, or how they can practice traditional activities on the land. Change conditions of the land due to business activities and related measures. This may mean that traditional activities are restricted or changed. For example, pollution can impact traditional farming practices. And business activities such as energy projects can lead to permanent or temporary migration away from traditional lands. This will also impact the ability to practice traditional activities. Business actors must therefore consider these types of impacts, amongst others, in their due diligence processes when conducting activities in and around Indigenous peoples' territories, lands, and natural resources. The right to work and equality in employment and occupations. Article 20 of UNDRIP says that Indigenous peoples' self-determination and autonomy relies on being secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and their freedom to engage in their traditional activities. These rights are reinforced by the following binding human rights standards. Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, on the protection of cultural rights. The Committee on Civil and Political Rights General Comment No. 23 on the Rights of Minorities, which recognizes that traditional activities of Indigenous peoples, such as fishing and hunting, are cultural manifestations that require the state to adopt legal measures for their protection, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or ICESCR, which guarantees the right to gain one's living by work which one freely chooses, Article 6.1, and prohibits forced or compulsory labor, Article 3a. The issues of human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor require some further explanation in the following. Human trafficking involves using force, fraud, or deception to exploit people for profit, and it affects individuals of all ages and backgrounds worldwide. Indigenous peoples are especially vulnerable due to overlapping forms of discrimination and poverty. ILO Convention No. 169 in Article 20.1 calls on states to take special measures to protect Indigenous workers during recruitment and employment. Forced labor is defined by the ILO as work done involuntarily under threat or penalty. CESCR's General Comment No. 23 on the right to just and favorable conditions of work highlights that banning forced labor is a core obligation for states in their laws and policies. Child labor is prohibited under ILO Conventions No. 138 on minimum age and No. 182 on worst forms of child labor, which set 15 as the minimum working age and 18 for hazardous work. Exceptions exist for light work or educational activities under strict conditions. Indigenous children face higher risks of exploitation due to poverty and discrimination, including in the worst forms of child labor. States must protect children from economic exploitation, which is also stated in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CRC, in Article 32(1, and take legal and policy measures, as outlined in the Committee on the Rights of the Child's General Comment No. 16 on state obligations regarding the impact of the business sector on children's rights, especially when businesses are involved. Under this domain, questions assess state efforts to regulate forced labor, human trafficking, and child labor of indigenous peoples through legislation and other special measures in relevant sectors, as well as data collected on the number of indigenous victims of human trafficking. They also aim to document the experiences of indigenous peoples on impacts of business activities on the performance of traditional occupation. Thank you for joining this video. Please explore the other video tutorials and materials on this page, should you need further guidance in using the surveys and planning capacity building workshops.